So today I'm speaking with Professor Eileen Barker, who is Professor Emeritus at the London School of Economics in the Sociology of Religion. And she's also the founder of Inform, where she is now an honorary research fellow. So thank you for joining me today.
Happy to be here.
Could you just introduce yourself and tell us about the founding of Inform?
Inform was founded in 1988. At the time I was studying new religious movements, and there was a lot of fright about them. People were very scared because the media was coming up with horror stories, and there was quite an active, what was called an anti-cult movement. And this comprised of worried parents and people who actually got a lot of money out of persuading parents that their children, they were adult children usually, had been brainwashed and hadn't really joined out of their own choice, but were doing it because they had been manipulated. And there was an awful lot of suffering for this. The kidnappers, illegal kidnapping would go on, and they would be held until they renounced their faith or managed to escape in some sort of way. And it had some very bad repercussions. And I had done my PhD on the Unification Church, known as the Moonies, and the brainwashing there, at the time was assumed to be the most efficient brainwasher. But I found that of all the people who went through the so-called brainwashing process, going away to a residential weekend, 90% of those people said, "Thanks very much, we don't want to join you." And so it obviously wasn't irresistible. And also it wasn't irreversible, because the majority of those who did join, the 10% who joined, had left within 2 years. And then later I was to find that nearly all of the first cohort of the first generation joined. So although the unificationists might have liked to have these brainwashing techniques, they certainly weren't irresistible. And there were other reasons why people joined for a short time. Some would stay on because they found it was doing what they wanted, and others were disillusioned. Anyway, that was the sort of general idea behind it. I thought it was important because a lot of scholars had been doing research into the new religions, and it was more important to find out what they were actually like, what their attraction could be, what their potential dangers were. And scholars tend to write rather boring things to gather dust in library shelves. So I thought it'd be good to try and act as a sort of medium through which academic scholarship could be made available to the general public, and in particular at that time, the concerned parents who were understandably, given what information they could get, very worried about the situation. So that was the start of Inform.
Mm-hmm. And then why did you feel that it was important to look at religious beliefs and practices in a comparative context?
Well, comparison is the very basis of all science, the natural sciences and the social sciences. And it's important to recognize or try and understand what goes with what and what does not go with what. For example, if you keep reading in the newspaper that members of a cult have committed suicide, and it could be perfectly true that several have committed suicide, you then start to think, what is it about cults that makes people commit suicide? However, if you do a comparative study of suicide in mainstream religion, say, or in the general population, you might find that the rate of suicide in the new religious movement or cult is less. And that would make you then think, well, what is it about the movement that stops people committing suicide? So it's very important to compare rates. At the moment with COVID, people are talking about numbers, but actually if you look at rates, you can learn a lot more than numbers, because it depends what base you start from.
Okay, and then what about the importance of understanding the wider social context?
Well, I think we're all influenced by the social context. Man is a social animal, so is woman. And we grow up within a certain environment. If you grow up in a Hindu environment, you see the world in a very different way than if you grow up in a fundamentalist Christian environment, or if you grow up in an atheistic environment. And so I think it is important to get some sort of idea of what the environment is at a wide, broad level, but also the family and early influences. There's a continual ongoing between the individual who may affect or be affected by society as an ongoing process the whole time. There are certain conditions in which the individual has less choice open to him or her, and others in which they have more choice. Sometimes if there's too much choice, you've actually got less choice, paradoxically, because you don't know which to choose. So it's fairly complicated, but there's an ongoing relationship. And apart from having a gun put to your head, you've usually got some leeway, and some people actually choose to be shot because they believe fundamentally in something, or they don't want to give away some secrets. Then do whatever it is the person who's holding the gun wants them to do.
Mm-hmm. And can you say something about the importance of the control group in the scientific study of religion?
Well, a control group, you use, excuse me, you use a control group when you want to see whether two variables, like in the example I gave, suicide and religious membership, are related, and whether they're positively related or negatively related. So if you see that two things go together, for example, when I was studying the Unificationists, excuse me, when I was studying the Unificationists, when I was interviewing them, and I interviewed them on a random sample, which meant each person in the movement had an equal chance of being selected by random, rather than just interviewing the people who said they wanted to be, or the leaders wanted me to interview. When I was interviewing them, I found that quite a lot had come from unhappy or broken families. But when and in America, I found that a lot of them had been on drugs, whereas a lot of them in England had taken more alcohol. And then I did a control group. That is, I got people who were as similar in age and socioeconomic background as I could find, who were nothing to do with the Unification Church. And I found that there were more people, a higher percentage in the control group with these characteristics than there were in the Unificationists, among the Unificationists. The variables, the drug taking or what have you, or the suicide in the earlier example, were certainly there, but they weren't there as much. So you couldn't say that if they hadn't been there at all, then you would suspect that there was a link between the movement and the whatever it was, the drug taking. And so the control group allows you, through comparison, to find out how much you can relate these two variables with each other, or whether the relationship is a wider one and the Unification Church is just a subsection, or even something that stops people doing certain things because it's a negative relationship.
So if we turn now to health and healing, can you tell us a bit about why you got interested in this topic?
Well, I actually got interested in it before I started studying new religions. I was studying science and religion, and the different things that scientists would say, I can tell you that the Bible is true, I can tell you that the Bible is false because I'm a scientist. And one of them, the different groups of scientists, were sort of New Age or forward-looking kind of scientists who would go into what other people might call pseudoscience or parascience and look at the paranormal and things like that. And they would be talking about healing, both how you could produce healing through scientific methods which weren't normally accepted, or why people were suffering or what have you. So that was when I first realized there was, and where, on the other hand, the sort of fundamentalist Christians would believe that through prayer you could get healing. So there were quite a lot of different ways in which people, scientists, would say you can get healing or have different attitudes to the body. The New Agers would be far more holistic. And then there were the Marxist scientists who rejected bourgeois science. And they too would say that it was the system that caused all the faults and illnesses, etc. So that was my initial curiosity about health not just being seen as straightforward and healing illness. There were different concepts. So that was originally why I got interested. And then once I started studying new religious movements, and particularly I think once I started going to the Far East, to China, Korea, Vietnam, Japan, there were very different ways of looking, India, at health and body and what have you. So it's been a sort of gradual growth of awareness of the different worldviews that incorporate ideas about health and healing.
Can you just tell us a bit about the difference between health and healing as concepts?
Healing implies that something is wrong and has to be put right, whereas health is more being in a state which is healthy, but you might want to be more healthy. Healing is a correction, whereas being concerned about one's health is probably more preventative. There are certain overlaps because people use it in different ways. Healing usually implies, well, something isn't functioning properly. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're ill. If I break my ankle, I don't think of myself as ill, but I want my ankle to heal. When I was pregnant, some people would think that I was ill in some way and treat me as though I were ill or needed healing, whereas most women, if were feminists, would say this is something perfectly natural. So generally speaking, though, the healing is having to do something, but the health is also having to keep it or become healthier, but not implying that something is necessarily wrong. It's stopping something being wrong.
Mm-hmm. So can you just talk us through some of the different ideas around health and healing in some of the religious groups that you've looked at?
Well, there are lots of different causes and there are lots of different cures. One sharp divide is between the holistic approach, which believes you've got to look at the whole body, and perhaps the environment, perhaps the cosmos, Gaia, or what have you. But for example, when I went to hospital in China with a bad knee, I had an acupuncturist put a needle in my left finger. So part of the idea there was that my knee was bad, not because I'd fallen over and bruised that particular part, but because my chi wasn't working properly, the flow needed to be opened up. Whereas if I had been in England with the National Health Service, then I might have had an operation or been given pills, and the knee itself would have been treated. So there's the difference, I think, was quite a big one, whether you approach the whole, which is what is more likely to happen in New Age and in Eastern medicines, Indian, Chinese, Korean, the Chinese conventional, traditional religion. They're all slightly different, but they do share this belief that you have to treat the whole rather than a particular part. So they wouldn't go to my kidney through my foot, as in reflexology or something like that. You would look at the foot if you got a sore foot or whatever it is. So I think that's probably the biggest difference in approaches to healing. Causes, of course, can vary. They can be physical, you've been struck by something, you've taken the wrong food, or you've taken a poison, or it can be that you've been hexed by a witch, or that God is paying you back or your tribe back. It's your karma, something you did in your past life. There's a very wide variety. You've behaved badly. It's psychological, it's emotional, it's all in your head because your boyfriend has left you or your father has died. And so it's psychosomatic. All these different ideas can be found.
Mm-hmm. So what is it that might need healing? You've talked a little bit about the holistic worldview and, you know, healing your knee through acupuncture in your finger and so on. But in terms of a broader view of what needs healing?
Well, something physical or something emotional or spiritual healing. There are sort of different levels of concreteness. It might be that the environment needs healing. It might mean that you've got to change your mind, your attitude, or it might mean that you've got to take pills or undergo surgery. It's impossible to sort of cover the whole spectrum because there are so many differences and combinations. I mean, you have both alternative and complementary medicines. People talk about the alternative being generally that you don't do the National Health Service, whereas the complementary use the National Health Service. We're talking about Britain here, of course, and something else, herbal medicines or acupuncture or doing yoga or meditation or praying, going to a healer. All these different things can be done and appealed to. There's somebody in Israel called, what's her name, Mariana Rudi Midbar, who's had an interesting paper where she said that the idea about healing has changed in the use of words. She says, you know, in sort of pre-modern times or in primitive societies, speaking very broadly, you use words to make somebody ill or to make somebody better. You know the right abracadabra kind of words that you use. Whereas modern medicine, words are used just to describe and they don't affect the illness at all. And then in postmodern, what she calls postmodern society, you use the words yourself to make something happen. So you say, I am well and I become well. And it's the words are the healing because you become what you say you are. I think that's quite interesting distinctions which describe some of the many differences in attitudes to healing and health.
Mm. And you touched on this already a bit with that description of the article and ideas around alternative as compared to complementary therapy. But can you just say a little bit about some of the different interrelationships between religious and secular healing practices?
Well, the religious is more likely to appeal to the non-empirical, non-objective, whereas the religious is more likely to be subjective, non-empirical, ideas about spirits affecting demons, needing exorcism, for example. Whereas the secular is more likely to be using the pills or the surgery and looking for objective justifications. But there's a lot of overlap, and it's very difficult to say sometimes whether something is religious or spiritual. I mean, some is obvious. If you're going to pray to a deity, or you believe that if you're Muslim, you're talking about jinns, or an African, perhaps you're talking about child witches. The secular, sometimes what seems religious to us is secular and part of the natural culture to other people. So they don't think that something like certain rituals are religious. They're just a sort of secular way of behaving, like washing your teeth or something like that. So I think it's useful to make strong distinctions in this area, as indeed most areas of social science. But usually you'll find a society or a movement that blurs the boundaries or draws the boundaries in different places. And that's the case, I think, with religious and secular. The secular, you see, they're quite likely to say it's in your head and give some sort of emotional or psychosomatic explanation. And you could change some of the words, like bad thoughts, to the idea that the thoughts have been implanted. It's quite interesting that the Roman Catholic Church now, which goes in for exorcism in quite a long way, getting rid of spirits, when priests are being trained in this, or deliverance, they call it in the Church of England, where they do it too, they're trained now to try to recognize when it's a mental illness and when it's a spirit coming in. So they've sort of recognized that it isn't always easy to tell whether it's something secular or something religious.
And what about the role of the healer in this?
Yes, the healers, again, take a wide variety of forms. You know, they may be shamans, or they may be a sort of middle-aged, middle-class lady in Pimlico or somewhere. Some of them claim that they have some particular power that they've inherited. Some have to go through quite rigorous training to become a healer. A lot of spiritualists go through fairly rigorous trainings to be able to see and hear and communicate with the spirit world. And shamans too, although in the sort of Western New Age, very often you can get instant enlightenment. Some healers say, I have the power and I will bestow it on you. Others will say, I channel the power. It comes from some divine source, and it's this that enables me. It's nothing to do with me. And others will say, It's a combination. The channeling can only be done if I am capable of opening myself and transferring the warmth, the healing power, or the exorcism of the devils, or what have you. So again, you get combinations, but you do get the extremes of I am just a channel and it's absolutely nothing, and it's all me.
Something that we haven't touched on yet is the role of food in all of this. Have you seen examples of food as a healing practice?
Oh yes, food is very important because, of course, we all eat. Although there are some movements which say you don't eat, the breatharians, and there's the MMM, Magnificent Meal Movement. That's not quite right. Where either the leader or the followers, women in both those cases, say you live off air, you breathe in the air, and this provides all the nutrients you need. But generally speaking, we all need food. And in fact, some of us skeptically would say that the breatharians and the MMMs need food too. It can be poisonous food. Quite often, food is seen, certain foods are seen as bad, but a whole lot of others have healing properties. Vegetarianism and now veganism even more so are seen as healing foods. It's interesting, when Eastern religions came over to the West in the 60s, particularly after the Americans changed their immigration laws, a whole lot of gurus came over. And I remember in the 70s, the Hare Krishna movement was very much frowned upon and thought of as unhealthy because they were vegetarians and didn't have good proteins and raw meat and things. Whereas now, there are vegetarian restaurants, there are health foods, and there are health foods popping up all over the place which are vegetarian. And vegan, or vegan some people call it, where you use no animal products at all. That is becoming more popular for health reasons, for other reasons as well, because of care for both the animals and the environment as well. So it isn't only for health that you get a lot of these attitudes towards food. A lot of religions also make special foods. Happy, Healthy, Holy, or Sikh Dharma organization, they have delicious herbal teas. And there are a whole lot of other branded things, like the Seventh-day Adventists, Kellogg's cornflakes, which everybody eats. Some people say it's just sort of cardboard, and other people say it's health-giving, fibers or what have you. Of course, you could say in some way that a whole lot of the herbal medicines are food, and all through the ages, through the millennia, as far as the East is concerned, certainly, there have been the wise women or the monks who have got special gardens with special herbs, or they go into the forest and gather these. There are crazes in the West the whole time. You should eat avocados, you shouldn't eat avocados. You should drink a lot of milk, you shouldn't drink a lot of milk. Some of these have been more substantiated by modern science, but then sometimes modern science has been shown to be wrong because there are side effects. If you have too much of something rather than too little, you eat too much, obesity is a great problem. So it's the quantity as well as the quality of the food. So that's an enormous subject in itself, the different kinds of food, or what we take into our bodies. And of course what we excrete from our bodies. Scientology, for example, does a purification course where you sweat and you go running and get rid of all the nasty things that you've taken in, and just sort of supplement with vitamins and minerals, things like that.
Mm-hmm. And have you found that any of these health and healing practices lead towards ideas of immortality?
Yes. Yes, some definitely do. They usually lead to some sort of disappointment because so far people have died. There are quite a few groups that have, at one time or another, said that they can live forever. You mean in this world?
Yeah.
Or are you talking about the sort of elixirs for the next world?
I meant more in this world.
Well, yes. No, there have been claims. There was a group I visited in Arizona called Forever Together, I think, where there were 3 people who, together, 2 men and a woman, were going to live forever because they'd got the right vibrations. They got in tune with physical vibrations. And the woman, she was as old as me and looked half my age. She was certainly very impressive. Yeah, that was sad, actually, because shortly after I'd been there, one of the men died. And I don't know how they've adjusted to that. Probably they'll blame him. There has been people who have died, and followers have kept body for a long time, saying that they're not really dead, which is slightly different. That has happened. There's a case in Japan, there's another case with an ultra-Orthodox rabbi, really. So there are claims, not all that often. It's usually for a longer life or a better quality life is often mentioned rather than the length. You don't want to live like a vegetable forever. You want to have a good life. And there have been cases, there was a case in France not very long ago where 2 women were taken out of a home, a sort of hospice that was run by their religious spiritual group, to be treated in a way that they didn't want to be treated. And they were very upset about this because they didn't want to sort of have a whole lot of tubes going into them and out of them. They actually preferred to die with people who thought the same way that they did and could share spiritual experiences. So that sort of thing is not infrequent. Or there was another case again in France where a couple were imprisoned because they didn't allow their child to have operations. He had a terminal heart condition, and they thought it was better for him to die with them and to give him all their love as their parents. There's sometimes clashes between the medicine that says we can keep you alive for longer and the people who say, no, we want a better quality, we want to have spiritual and be really human while we are alive, really spiritual or whatever it is.
And then just following on from that, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about some of the more problematic issues around religious healing, such as around faith healing or anti-vaccination or those kind of ideas.
Yes, well, of course, the COVID thing at the moment is providing us with a lot of examples. In America, people are getting very angry at being told to stay inside or wear masks because this offends against their freedom. And there are a whole lot of court cases that are going on about whether people, the state has the right to stop them from meeting in church. And a lot of Pentecostal groups and others have continued to meet because they believe that God will save them. And there have been some rather tragic results from this. Then there are worries expressed by society about organizations like Christian Science, where they believe that praying, and they have specially trained nurses and people who do pray and carry out certain spiritual practices, which they prefer to have, although they will use some medicine or some more, what's the word I want? It begins with C. More normal, conventional, thank you, conventional medicine. The Jehovah's Witnesses, again, with refusing blood transfusions. There have been several cases where somebody has died when they might have been saved had they had a blood transfusion. They say this is because it's in the Bible and it's part of their faith, that this is what God says, that they shouldn't take blood under these sort of conditions. But they could also point to the time when AIDS hadn't been fully diagnosed, and people with AIDS were donating blood. And I had a blood transfusion in Washington at that time. For ages, I was worried that I'd got AIDS because nobody knew what was happening. This is particularly controversial with children. If parents decide that their child should not receive transfusion or whatever it is, a vaccination, this, in cases of the Jehovah's Witnesses and the Christian Scientists, this affects Jehovah's Witnesses and Christian Scientists. But in the case in vaccinations, of course, this can affect a wider society. So ultra-Orthodox Jews who have refused vaccinations have had measles has spread throughout the community. And with the COVID, there's the argument that you should wear a mask not to protect yourself, but to protect other people. So it becomes more complicated when you're looking at the social implications. So that's just another angle to some of the problems that there are. And then there are fairly obvious problems to us in the West about some of the beliefs that you can find in Africa that some of the witch doctors give, where you need body parts in order to produce certain healings or ward off certain evil spirits or what have you. Some of the so-called witch doctors or the traditional healers, Sangoma, in South Africa, actually work with the official health service. And I met one Sangoma in South Africa who showed me a book that she had contributed to writing with the official medical service ministry in South Africa. And sometimes they would pass somebody on to her, and sometimes she would pass something on to their conventional medicine. But that's not always the case by any means.
So this is obviously a huge field, and we've just touched on it today. Is it something that you will continue to look at?
I hope so. If I live long enough, I've got to find the elixir. It's there's always something new popping up, and it really is. It's a curious field.
Thank you very much for talking with me today.
You're welcome, and good health to you.
And to you.